Mr. J. Christopher, protect the righteous with wisdom and strength.
Right? So my first question for you is this. How does race, class, and gender usually impact workplace environments? What is that like?
Well, usually it's a tough word because, I mean, it really does depend upon the organizational context. So if you are in an organization where from the beginning people have valued diversity, have valued different perspectives and whatnot, race and gender and other differences can be a positive. Okay. If you're in an organization, if you look at kind of how our organizations kind of function traditionally, go back 20 years, 30 years and whatnot, then oftentimes being different, people experience it in a negative way. Because at the end of the day, most people are kind of naturally wired to want to replicate themselves. So if you look at the people who are at the top, if they're all white males, then it's just a natural thing for people to look at junior folks who are white men too.
You said something I thought was really interesting. You said people have a natural instinct to replicate themselves.
Yes.
I just want to make sure we park there for a second because I don't think that people are aware of this subconscious bias. And we do it in everything, whether it's sports, business, romantic relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Because the thing is if you find somebody who's like you and then they do well, that reflects back on you and your own self-esteem. So if I mentor somebody who's like me and then they're successful, then I get to bathe in that success. I mean, one of the things that's really funny about this phenomenon is you don't really even have to know the person. So for example, the Olympics are going on right now. Every time an American athlete wins, every American feels a little bit better. Although we don't know the person, we had nothing to do with their career, their training or whatnot, but we experience that as a positive thing. We call it in-group favoritism in psychology.
Is that your PhD at work right now, David?
Yeah, that's my PhD at work.
Because I'm just saying things and dropping science on things that I've never heard before. No, that's deep. That's deep. Okay, even though they don't know the athlete and they have no connection to the sport, they're an American, they did well, I'm okay.
Right.
Right?
I'm better than other people because I'm an American too. I mean, it's one of the things that another example, say if you are in college and you go overseas with a bunch of students from your school, you may all be different on your college campus, but then when you go to France, you're all Americans in this different place. And so you all bond together.
Interesting.
And so the thing that's really interesting about that conceptually is if I can find ways to identify with you to make you part of my in-group as opposed to part of my out-group, then we can make a connection. So if I'm going into the workplace and I am a black male and my boss is a white female, but I can find some way we connect. Say we went to the same university, say we grew up in the same hometown. I grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, whatever. If I can find some place that we have in common, then I can go from being the out group to being an in group. And then she will view me in a very different way. Today, we all have something in common with everyone. The matter is how much time do you spend to figure out what you have in common with that person. But once you find that commonality, then it makes it real easy for you to decide to get to know them better, to like them better, to recognize the positive things they bring to the workplace or whatever.
So clearly the manager needs to invest the time to find that out. It's an extra little effort.
Well, it's the manager and the employee. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of times I used to find when I was doing my executive education training is that a lot of times you would see the diverse employees were like, well, look, I spend all my time working with white folks. So you're actually telling me that at night I have to go drink with them or I have to go play golf with them or I have to go out to dinner with them? I'm like, well, yes, you need to do that because you have to find ways to interact with them where you can find those things that are in common.
We call this, I think, the parlance is playing the game. Right?
Exactly.
You got to play the game.
You've got to play the game and everyone does that.
Interesting. Well, you raised another question, actually, that's not necessarily in my order, but I think this is important. You said everyone does that. Mm-hmm. And I think what you mean is to say everyone who's successful does that.
Yes.
The question is this. Number one, why do we sometimes not want to play the game? And how do we play it wrong?
Well, I think a lot of times we don't want to play the game because we think we're sacrificing too much of ourselves. So as one of my friends used to say, you can go to China and eat Chinese food, and that doesn't make you Chinese.
Okay.
And so once you recognize that you're not sacrificing yourself because you're going out to play golf, even though that's not something you usually do, or you're going out to drink with the fellows, which is something that you don't usually do, but you decide to do it because you're advancing your career, you're still true to who you are. You're not sacrificing who you are in order to do that.
Interesting. Yeah, another term of art you've heard used in many of these circles regarding this concept in particular is kissing butt, right? So I think, but the point you're making is you're not kissing butt. This is just part of the job,
right,
to advance your career that everyone is doing.
And everyone has to realize that we are making trade-offs in order to advance our career. You may have to work longer hours than you would like. You may have to be more responsive to your emails or texts than you would personally like, whatever. We all have to figure out what trade-offs we're willing to make in order to advance our career. And if there's trade-offs that we're not willing to make, be clear about that and then recognize you're going to have to make payments somewhere else.
Interesting.
So I may say, for example, when I show up for work, I don't like wearing a suit and tie. If everyone else is wearing a suit and tie and I don't, I can get away with that if I overperform in other things. And people will say they'll tolerate David showing up in his jeans and a t-shirt because he gets phenomenal results. If I only want to get average results, then I better show up in my suit and tie.
I see. So, okay, and I'm going to kind of rephrase that and reframe it a little bit and bring it down to a sport analogy. If you're walking through the door as Kobe, dropping 30, 40 points a game, so what? You don't play defense.
Right.
People,
exactly.
It doesn't matter. You're
exactly.
Kobe, you dropping for. So.
Well, one of the things also, when you're different from the majority, it can be both a positive and can be a curse. When you're different from the majority, and then you're also doing things which are perceived as negative within your organizational context, people are more likely to remember that.
Interesting.
It's not fair, but that's just the way the life is.
Wait, hold up, pull up on that. When you're different from the majority, which could help or hurt you, people remember when you're doing something outside the norm.
Right.
You stand out like a sore thumb with that neck tattoo.
Right. Exactly.
As maybe a dark complected man,
right,
or a transgender person. It's like, hey, I know you wanted to think that we don't notice your differences, but we do.
Right.
So take that into account, and that's just the way the world works.
That's just the way the world works. It's not right. It's not fair. It just is. And so once you understand that, you say, okay, well, to the extent that I want to be different in some ways, I have to, again, overperform in other ways. Now then, the flip side is if you overperform on the positive way and you do that consistently, eventually, and it takes some time, people will recognize that. But they're not going to recognize it the first or the second time you do that brilliant presentation. But by the fifth or sixth, they're going to say, wow, you're exceptional.
Yeah.
And then what happens is, as a black guy, you say, well, wait a minute, I don't want to be seen as just an exceptional black guy. There's other brilliant black guys out there too. But you take that as a compliment and you keep on moving with that.
Now, take into account what you just shared with us. I'm wondering this. Does the industry, region, and size of the company change your analysis that you just described to us? What about race versus gender, class versus sexual orientation? How does all this stuff impact the dynamic?
Well, I mean, certainly. The parts of the country you're in, the type of industry you're in, all that makes a difference because each industry in each part of the country has a different culture. So if you're in a place where, like Atlanta, where the black population is much larger than on average and the black professional population is large, there's probably going to be less problems than if you're in Utah.
Got it.
And you're a black American.
Got it. Or the foothills of Virginia.
Or if you're a Cuban American in Miami, your experience is going to be very different than if you're a Cuban in Des Moines, Iowa.
Exactly. I mean, and for the millennials watching, I think that the theme here is take account and take stock of the context of your situation. What your personal, what the personality, well, more so the personal characteristic that may make you stand out, the region of the country you're in, the city you're in, the place you work, the majority in that, the majority of that workforce. Basically, take this stuff into account before you maybe get the neck tattoo, or maybe before you wear a certain type of clothing. Again, like you said earlier, this is not a democracy.
Right.
This is not about being fair. You walk through the doors of an organization, you're expected to operate and present their expectations, not yours, right?
Right.
So if you want to work there, that's what you got to do.
And the thing is when you come in, people will judge you immediately before you even open your mouth. And so if you're coming in and you're wearing your jeans off your behind, people are going to automatically assume that you represent a certain part of the culture, which may be negative. No matter where you went to school, no matter what your degrees look like, etc. So the thing is, because first impressions matter, is you want to come in representing something that's consistent with your organization so that people have as few distractions beyond your race and gender and whatnot, so they can get to know you before they completely prejudge you.
Unless you're walking through the door as Jay-Z or Kobe.
Right.
Then wear your jeans down to your ankles.
Right, but remember, Jay-Z and Kobe did all the work beforehand.
True.
So by the time they walk in the door, they've got all this other stuff coming with us.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think, and I this is an interesting point, right? There's a nuance to this. If we're talking about artists in the context of their art and in the context of working for or on behalf of organizations that is engaging them as artists, there's obviously going to be more of a sliding scale, more forgiveness, because they expect you to be a little bit outside the norm. But if we're talking about people who want to, quote unquote, be executives or professionals, then that standard expectation, is sad to say, has been set by the white man and his, and all the culture that goes into what it means to be a white American. Like you said, it's not necessarily deliberately intended to exclude you, but by virtue of the approach you take, it can be exclusive, and you end up outside the community, so to speak, right?
Right.
So okay, great. Let me ask you this. What about, are there any particular characteristics or things that change that analysis when we're talking about media, entertainment, and or tech organizations?
Well, those two different environments are very different. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about media and entertainment is because there's such a low correlation between input and output, it's oftentimes very difficult for someone to know up front, hey, this idea is going to work. I mean, if you think about it this way, every TV show that gets put on the air, the network believes is going to work. No one intentionally puts on a show that's going to fail. Now, we know most shows fail.
Exactly.
And so if there's low correlation between the input and the output, it's hard for me to know whether, when the show fails, that you were a bad person and you came to me with a bad idea, you executed on it poorly, or it was just unfortunate, wrong place, wrong time. Now then, the reason why that has a diversity component is if I know you and I like you, I'm going to give you multiple times at bat. And probably if you're good and you get 3 or 4 shots, something's going to work out and you're going to get proof. Now then, if you're a person of color, you may not get those 3 or 4 shots. You may get that one shot. That first shot didn't work because odds are, for most people, the first shot's not going to work.
Exactly.
And then your career is over before you even started.
Wow.
And so that's how diversity can play in. And in tech, it's actually very interesting for a variety of reasons. One is, when you look at the people who go into, kind of hardcore engineering and computer science, we see lower numbers of women and people of color. And that happens, part of it's for self-selection reasons. Part of that is because a lot of times girls and black and brown boys are tracked into non-math and non-STEM fields early on, and so they don't have the skill set that they need to even think about engineering. And then that is in the most select kind of technical companies, there tends to be this bias about where you got your training from. If you're at Google or someplace like that, there is a real preference for Stanford, MIT, and Berkeley engineers. There's only so many of those, and there's only a few of those that are black and brown.
Great point.
So no one's interested in you if you went to San Jose State School of Engineering, which you may have a great degree from there.
Well, playing devil's advocate, and I don't have a technical background, but I'm just curious: is it a fair preference or having the what's the term I'm looking for? Proclivity to hire people from the Ivies and the high versus the Howards and the Hamptons and the schools that may be state and university schools when it comes to this particular area?
Well, and I would say it's a search problem. So yes, the average capability of a Stanford engineer might be higher than the average capability of a San Jose State engineer. I'm a Stanford engineer, so I'm slightly biased.
Yes.
But with that said, probably a San Jose State top engineer is probably on par with any Stanford engineer. So basically what I would say is that you just have to work a little bit harder to find the cream of the crop in the schools which have a lower average kind of quote unquote rating.
I see. Yeah. It's interesting. My background is in law, and I have a couple of friends who ended up going to HBCUs, black law schools, primarily for the purpose of being quickly identified when the traditional law firms are looking to hire diverse candidates. These guys in particular, I'm thinking of at the top of their class, so they stood out, like you said, and they perform very well, and they've done very well with their careers. But I don't think for most, at least not for me, it was kind of the obvious choice. Probably the wrong term, but let me go to more the designer school, the household name school, because that's where they're going to find me. And the reality is, it doesn't necessarily work that way, like you just pointed out.
Right. Well, I mean, the thing is, if you go to a school with a bigger name, it allows you a little bit more flexibility around your performance. So if you are an average student at Harvard or Stanford, you're still going to get a good job. If you're an average student at Harvard Law or Stanford Law, you're still going to get a good job. If you're an average student at Howard Law, it could be a little bit more of a challenge.
Interesting. What steps do employees tend to take to try to achieve parity in these organizations when they're working among their peers? And what do they typically get wrong? We talked a little bit about, hey, I don't want to go to the drinks meeting or the drinks hangout. I don't want to play golf. But, what do we do right and what do we do wrong and what do we just do?
Well, I think one of the things, particularly that people who are different, whether it be around race, gender, et cetera, what they do is they think that if I perform extremely well, that's going to be enough. And that certainly works early in your career. But by the time you get to the mid-levels in your career and you're trying to look to be successful, everyone who's on the short list for that next promotion is always going to be a great performer. So the question then becomes, what are the other things you're bringing to the table? And so that then is about what's the nature of your network? What's the nature of the people who are mentoring you? Do you have sponsors? And what I mean by that is, do you have people who sing your praises when you're not in the room? They may not be a direct mentor who really works with you on a regular basis, but they will say, hey, I heard great things about Chris, and so y'all are thinking about him for this position. You all should definitely talk to him. And so the thing is, if you want those types of relationships, you got to work to create them. You have to be strategic about that. A lot of people just aren't. They just think that their good work is going to be enough to draw that kind of attention and to draw those types of recommendations. And it just doesn't happen that way.
That's a great point, actually. I mean, I could obviously attest to the importance of the term that I would tend to use was like rabbi or cheerleaders in the organizations. But if you're going to be in these companies, you need those people to be your allies when you're not in the room. Right. And really champion you, and people who have, respect and influence, cross departmentally. People in the organization, they're just known to be solid people, and because they're representing or I guess supporting your path, you'll be that much well received because of that. Right. So yeah, that's critical for the success. And I think you're right. I think sometimes we just think, oh, I did the project, I killed it, I got there on time, whatever it is, and that's enough, and we just check out. But you got to build a team of, like you said, senior executives that will mentor you, support you, praise, sing your praises, and be your support network in that organization.
And one of the things, a trap to be careful of, is if you look around and all the people in your network, and you're at the top of the network, then something's wrong. You always have to have people in your network who are at higher levels than you are.
That's right.
So if I deal with vice presidents and executive vice presidents, if I'm at that level, then I need to make sure I've got CEOs and board members who are part of my network as well, because those are the people who are going to influence my next promotion.
Exactly.
Not the people who are at my level, and certainly not the people below me. Now, those people who are at your level and below are important for your network for other reasons, but you need to make sure your network really cuts across the entire organization.
Okay, so now how does age and the generation of the workforce impact the choices both the managers and subordinates make in achieving that parity? So Gen Y, Gen X, millennials?
Well, I mean, we're still trying to figure that out. One of the things that's interesting is millennials have come into the workplace with very different perspectives on how their lives should be, based upon how they were raised and whatnot. And organizations are trying to be flexible to accommodate them, while also recognizing that organizations depend upon people to respond in certain ways. And so there's easy ways in which our companies will bend. And so they'll try to be a little bit more flexible with time and stuff like that. But there's other ways where the millennials are going to have to learn to conform because that's what the organization requires. And so how that balance all plays out, we still don't completely know. And then there's also, but one of the things that's interesting about it is that there are a lot of millennials who are still looking for, very senior people who can be, kind of give them insights because they don't have anyone to help them figure it out. And they've been, coddled is probably the wrong word, but a lot of times the helicopter parents have protected them from a lot of the stuff that we would have learned about the organization.
Like everyone gets a trophy?
Right, exactly.
There's no one loses?
No one loses,
Yeah.
but the thing is, if no one loses, then no one gets trained on what you need to do in order to win. So they need people who can help them with that. And they need to find people who are able to give them constructive, critical feedback.
Yeah.
Because that's the only way that you grow. And I always tell folks, look, if everyone tells you that everything that you're doing is great, then they're not doing you a favor. So when your boss gives you a review and says you're doing a great job, you say thank you. Now, are there any things that I could do a little bit different to do an even better job? Or what are some of the things you want to give them permission to give you that constructive, critical feedback that you can then take in?
That was deep.
Well, because here's the problem, especially if your boss is different from you, they're scared. Oftentimes they're scared to give you that constructive, critical feedback because they don't want to be labeled as being racist or sexist.
That's such a great point. You have to open up that door. You got to open up that feedback door. Otherwise, like you said, people will be, especially in the culture we operate in now, where there's this hypersensitivity to offend, and there's this hyper political correctness. I don't want to say something. She may take that wrong.
Right.
So it's like, let them know that, hey, I want your feedback.
Right.
Let me ask you this, because millennials oftentimes get a bad rap from our generation. But I'm curious to know from your research or from your experience, what do they tend to do right? What do they tend to do better than our generation in the workforce?
Well, I think one of the things is they're more open to taking a different approach. And one of the things is, as any company, any organization needs, people who can provide different and creative thoughts. And so we're going to think outside of the box. And so the challenge for companies is when they bring those different ideas in to figure out how they can take that input in and build it into the company overall.
Interesting. Ask you this, because millennials oftentimes get a bad rap from our generation. But I'm curious to know from your research or from your experience, what do they tend to do right? What do they tend to do better than our generation in the workforce?
Well, I think one of the things is they're more open to taking a different approach. And one of the things is, as any company, any organization needs, people who can provide different and creative thoughts. And so we're going to think outside of the box. And so the challenge for companies is when they bring those different ideas in to figure out how they can take that input in and build it into the company overall.
Interesting. Good. That's good to know. Look, you guys, millennials, listening and watching, you guys are the future, right? Everyone's trying to focus their marketing dollars on you guys and trying to capture your attention, build with you. So you guys have a lot of sway right now in all things, in all industries. So use that power wisely, right? And, I think one of the things you said about this, which is so key, and I hope there are people watching who are at the level in an organization where they can really make an impact. But you got to have that diverse voice in the room, and he's not an assistant. Mm-hmm. I've been part of so many meetings and so many companies where I'm the only dude in the room, not the only dude, the only black male in the room, and in a few instances in my early career, I definitely didn't have a voice. If I did, I'd probably be labeled as the problematic black guy, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't want to speak up. And in other instances where I kind of had a little more heft and a little more weight, I had to be very, measured in how I address something that was quote unquote racially sensitive. So again, for those hiring managers, those recruiters, those CEOs, put people in the room that have some authority, hire them, train them, grow them within your organization, because even if you don't recognize the value they have, the larger community will. Right. And maybe it'll save you millions of dollars lost because you made some huge mistake in fitting our culture.
Well, I agree. You definitely, as a manager, you want to empower the people who are different to have a voice. But I think also the people who are different have to find ways to communicate hey when stuff is happening. We have to at some point say, hey, if I'm going to be successful in my job, here's what my moral compass is. I may deviate a little bit here or there because we all have to make compromises, but when I see something that is really problematic, I make as a choice that I'm going to speak up. That may cost me in the short term, but I believe that that gives you value over the long term. If you have no moral compass, if you're always going back and forth with whichever way the tide goes, you're probably not going to be successful either.
Yeah, this conversation kind of took me back to a moment in time where I was working for a large media organization, and it was the day after Obama was elected into office, and we had one of our big, production meetings. And, in that meeting, we would talk about topical events as well as business. And, I was sitting there kind of like festering in the fact that like there was no mention of this monumentous event that happened in American history. And I was like, I know someone's going to say something. I'm just waiting for someone to say something. No one said a thing. And I was like, and then I didn't have the courage, to be honest with you, at the time to be like, hey guys, does anyone want to take note of the fact that we have our first African American president in all of our American history, in all of the country's history, and the legacy of this country? I mean, but again, I was like, let me keep my little check and let me just focus on what my job is and not quote unquote be vocal in an environment that I might have helped spur a great conversation or impacted someone in some way. So anyway, what do you say to people out there who like that's just affirmative action, giving someone the benefit that they haven't earned? Like they shouldn't give a chance to that.
Well, what those programs try to do is give people access to the networks that a lot of people already have access to because of family connections and stuff like that. I mean, if we look at, kind of the makeup of the entertainment industry writ large, it's still predominantly white. People still, how we structure the nature of getting into the jobs and having to start out working in mailrooms, places with where you're not getting paid, but minimum wage and whatnot. What that does is that selects based upon class. Because if you're poor, you can't afford to come and work in the mailroom in LA. And so there's ways in which certain groups have some advantages for getting into the workplace. And our industry says that at the end of the day, for us to be successful, we need to have diverse voices all the way throughout, because that's how we create great content that appeals to diverse audiences. And so we're doing things which allow us to make up for the other ways in which some groups have some advantages and other groups don't.
No, that's a really great point. I just want to park this for a second before we transition out. You said it. The jobs in the agency mailroom, right? Or in my case, my first job as a lawyer was at the DA's office in Brooklyn. Those jobs pay little to no money, and you really have to either have some resources taking those jobs, family resources, or you really just rolling the dice. You don't have anyone to support. Maybe you're sleeping on someone's couch. And you have the ability to just make those sacrifices to take that opportunity, which is going to lead to amazing things. But because it doesn't offer the financial support you need, it's really a gamble and very exclusive, ironically enough, right? So I just think that's something that I think we don't tend to think about. That is those of us who have options. Don't think about when we're looking at people who may not have as many options because of the financial implications of the opportunity.
Mr. J. Christopher, protect the righteous with wisdom and strength.